Everyone, it's Jen Fishburne from San Antonio, Texas, and I will be taking the worldwide position in this debate on Noah's Ark and the flood. So, here we go. Once upon a time, on a land far, far away, there was a flood, or two, or perhaps hundreds or thousands. Floods happen around the world every year, and history is literally filled with flood stories. But why is the story of Noah's Ark so vastly different from all the other flood accounts? Was it just one of many myths? Was it just one of thousands and thousands of local floods? Or was it unique in some special way? This debate is a three-way debate on the story of Noah's Ark. I do not yet know my opponents, Robert Rowe, who takes the local position, or Joel Anderson, who takes the myth position, but I look forward to getting to know them over the next 4 weeks. For my part in this debate, I will be presenting only my evidence for a worldwide flood in my opening statement and will not be addressing any of the arguments my opponents may or may not make until the rebuttals. That means that I am saving a great deal of material to counter their arguments. I also will not be engaging in any personal attacks against my opponents and shall ignore any directed my way. I realize that both the local view and the myth view are on the rise lately, and that I am probably in the minority view at this point. So I need to present convincing evidence for the worldwide view. I am also looking forward to the flood of memes attacking my position, and we'll have a good laugh at all of them. No debate is designed to convince the opposing sides to change their minds. Most debaters are already entrenched in their beliefs. Debates are for the readers, especially those who are still studying the topic and have not come to a definitive conclusion yet. In this debate, none of us will present a 100% conclusive position. Much of what each of us presents will be conjecture, although that should be based upon as many facts as possible. None of us were there when Noah's Ark was floating on the waters, so we can only go by the evidence we can gather today. It is my hope that each reader will consider all the evidence presented and make a decision based upon the preponderance of evidence for the most likely scenario. Whatever our view of Noah and his ark is most likely going to be connected to our view of the creation story, and to both our view of Scripture and our worldview as well. These four views tend to go hand in hand. If you experience cognitive dissonance as you study through this debate with us, it could be that your view on the Bible, creation, or your worldview today is not lined up correctly with one another. I fully realize that those who are deeply entrenched in modern-day science being infallible, or in creation being something other than heavens and earth, in believing that the Bible is either full of myths or full of errors, or that Adam was about Israel instead of mankind, that we probably do not have enough common ground to reason together. My perspective comes from the viewpoint that the Bible is true, unless we are told it is a parable or analogy, or it is obviously using a figure of speech in a particular genre. While I do believe that there are many layers of meaning in many of the stories in the Bible, I also believe that there is a primary story that can be taken at face value. The story of Noah and his 3 sons, I believe, is believable as it is written in the Bible, even though there are much deeper meanings in addition. Since I only have 10 pages to present all the evidence I can for a worldwide flood, I will attempt to summarize each point as clearly and concisely as possible. I will not be using references in this written statement simply because there is no room to do so. If you would like to further study the points I bring up, I can provide references later. Since this is a Bible story, let's begin with the Bible. The story of Noah is both a decreation and a creation story. In Genesis 1, we have the creation of the heavens and the earth. Notice it does not say world or universe there. The Hebrew for create is bara, which does not mean to make something out of nothing, although God is certainly capable of doing so. Bara means to fashion or form raw materials into something usable. In a crude analogy, we use the ingredients to form a cake. So the heavens and the earth were already in place in verse 1, but now God is going to fashion them into something usable. Verse 2 denotes a birth, like that of a watery sack, which contains a baby. The baby is inside the womb all along, but it is surrounded by water, and there is no real form or substance in the beginning. But everything that is needed to make that fetus grow into a full adult 20 years down the road is within that little being in the womb. And then there is a birth, and rapid growth begins to take place. It seems to me that Genesis 1 is the story of this birth and rapid growth of the earth. The proponents of the Big Bang Theory believe that everything began with a burst of light. That seems to match up with verse 3, doesn't it? So both the Bible and the scientists agree that light was there before the sun. Then the waters were separated to those above and those below. That is the baptism of the earth, just as each one of us is baptized when we are born and the water sack breaks. God gathered the lower waters together into one ocean, and then the dry land begins to come up out of that ocean. That dry land is perhaps the one continent called Pangaea that we began with. Out of that land, all the plants began to grow. All the DNA for that vegetation was already present in that fetus before the birth of the earth. And now this baby is starting to become a toddler and develop some of the formation God had intended for it. The basic structure, which may be very small at this point, is in place now, but it needs a few decorations. Whether the sun, moon, and stars, no planets, were already fashioned or not, we are not told, but they are hung in place on day 4. We are told that the sun would give light to the earth, but on day 1, light was already given to the earth. So there was never a time when the earth did not have light. Then came the fish, birds, and sea creatures, as well as land animals, reptiles, insects, and land creatures. Now all of these animals came forth from the earth as if God had planted them in all the right places, just like our fingernails and eyebrows and pubic hairs come out at just the right time as we grow and develop. And then God took some dirt and formed it into a man and breathed the breath of life into him. Adam and Eve were told to be fruitful and multiply, to be vegans, and to take control over the animals and the vegetation. They were also told not to partake of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but they very much wanted to know about both good and evil, just as most of us do when we are teenagers. So whatever their original sin was, they did it. And that brought a curse on the earth, the land. I tend to think that the 2 trees in the garden, whether literal or not, were representative of Jesus and a watcher. This watcher was a god, and Enoch tells us that these gods taught mankind all sorts of things. They probably taught man how to build things, architecture, fire, farming, musical instruments, and all sorts of great knowledge. They also taught women how to dress sexy, how to make and wear jewelry and makeup, and to entice men. These gods and watchers taught man magic and medicine, and they definitely taught them all sorts of sexual immorality. 2 Peter 2:4-5 tells us that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but preserved Noah with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. These gods or watchers were heavenly beings, a form of angel, and they were able to take on earthly forms when they came into the earthly realm, such as reptiles, serpent, dragon, beast, etc., as well as human form. These gods in human form certainly must have stood out as bigger and better in every way than a typical man, and they began to take human women for their wives and have babies with them. Why was this a problem? Because Jesus had to come from a purely human bloodline in order to redeem mankind. And these half-god, half-man creatures, which were gigantic, the Nephilim, were mixing the seed line so that mankind would not be able to be bought back or redeemed by a man. This brings us to why God decided to start over again. Noah was blameless in all his generations, which simply means that his bloodline was pure. There were no gods in his ancestry, and we know his ancestors from Adam to Noah. So, beginning with the knowledge of evil upon the face of the earth, since it had spread across the whole continent of Pangaea, wherever people lived in the time from Adam to Noah, and adding to that widespread worldwide wickedness, since we have no record of wickedness only pertaining to a small section of the world, the interbreeding of heavenly or spiritual beings, gods, sons of God, and human women, daughters of Adam, producing this half-breed race of giants, Nephilim, that wreaked havoc all across the earth, as we read about in the many mythological stories from every ancient culture. Why do we assume all these cultures made up these stories instead of reading them as history? The stories of the gods are very likely historical stories, albeit somewhat embellished, But the truth is that these gods interbred with human women, and their offspring promoted great wickedness everywhere they roamed. All flesh was corrupt on earth. Time to start over. So the decreation process began. But first, God is going to save a tiny remnant in order to continue the bloodline from Adam to the last Adam. This could not be just any random righteous person. It had to be someone in the line of both Adam and Seth, who was the chosen bloodline to the Messiah. In order to save this tiny remnant, God told Noah what he was planning to do and gave Noah instructions to build an ark, basically some kind of floating box out of wood. We are given only a few details in Scripture on what that looks like, but we can safely assume that either Noah was already an expert wood craftsman, a boat builder, or God gave him more specific instructions on how to master this project. It is likely that Noah had at least 100 years in which to accomplish this, along with figuring out all the logistics for making this happen. We simply do not know what Noah did during those 100 years, but it is not unreasonable to think that he was, first, highly intelligent, and second, had plenty of time to figure out how to save his family and the animals from the wrath to come, since God had shown him his cards already. The Bible is full of hundreds of stories that do not give us all the details, such as what exactly Adam and Eve did in that garden, how God showed Abram where to go, how Moses survived on all those trips up Mount Sinai, or how David got all those Philistinian foreskins for Saul, and thousands of others. But we don't question all the details of every story in the Bible the way we do that of Noah and the flood. It really does come down to whether or not you believe the Bible is true. However, for this debate, we are going to take a look and see if a worldwide flood is even possible. I believe that it is not only possible, but the only logical position. If all flesh on the created earth, one piece of land drawn out of the sea, ocean, that was corrupt, wicked, and filled with violence, was just referring to a local, small, unnamed piece of land, then your view of creation would also have to be a local, small piece of land as well, since the curse that was pronounced upon the land after the original sin was being reversed in this flood, Genesis 5:29. If Noah and his family couldn't figure out how to take a few animals found only in his neck of the woods and get 100 miles away from home within 100 years, then this otherwise amazing story should be called Noah, the Village Idiot Who Survived Hurricane Noah. We would actually laugh and make memes of this guy if this story happened today. But I digress. First, the size of the ark in the Bible is given in cubits. A biblical cubit is the distance from your elbow to the end of your middle finger, which eventually became standardized as 18 inches, or 45.7 centimeters long. However, depending on whose arm it was, it could definitely vary. If they used those giants for a frame of reference at that time, it would have been significantly larger. But let's stick with the traditional measurements for our study here. 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet. Genesis 7:20 tells us that the ark had a draft depth of 15 cubits. The waters prevailed, which means that 22.5 feet of the ark was below sea level. Also, the mountains were covered with water, but we are not told by how much. We all know that boats are partially submerged. So this number, 22.5 feet of 45 feet high, tells us that exactly half of the ship's height was below sea level when it reached floating status. Based upon this information, in a marine engineering study conducted by Hong and Associates in 1994, an empty ark would have weighed approximately 4,000 tons. The animals would have weighed about 111 tons at the beginning of the flood, and with growth and perhaps a few babies, weighed a combined total of 411 tons by the time they disembarked, if there were no deaths. If they started with 2,500 tons of food and 4,070 tons of water, the details we'll get to in a minute, the total mass of the beginning cargo would be 11,000 tons. So the following calculations give a 6,000 ton spare mass leeway. As we go through these possible figures, keep in mind that these are very lenient numbers and that the ark could have held significantly more. There's an oil tanker named Mont, previously known as the Sea-Wise Giant, among other names, who was 1,504 feet long by 226 feet wide with a draft of 81 feet. It has a gross capacity of 260,941 tons. This ship is far larger than Noah's Ark would have been, so we know that that is not an issue. But let's look at them proportionally. In meters, the Mont was 458 times 68, while the Ark was 450 times 75 in feet. Very similar. The Mont had a draft of 24 meters, while the Ark's was 22.5 meters. Sounds like there is some serious boat building math going on in the Bible. Although the details were not exact, there are several historians who have written about Noah's Ark who believe it to be real. Augustine, 5th century, said it was 3 stories high, 300 cubits by 50 cubits. Origen, 3rd century, writes of the separate dwelling places for the tame and wild animals, as well as how they were all cared for. Josephus, 1st century, adds a few details to the biblical proportions. Bishop Wilkins, in 1668, made a very detailed chart showing where he thought each of the animals spent their year on the ark. Jesuit German scholar Athanasius Kircher also put together extremely detailed calculations in 1675. None of these are proof of anything in and of themselves, so I will not put their exact quotes here, but the idea is that notable scholars and historians have held that the story of Noah and his ark, was indeed a true historical story. While various boats are dated back about 10,000 years ago, we do know that the Egyptians were building wooden ships by around 3000 BC. They used reeds or grass in between the planks to help seal the seams. This is interesting because the Hebrew word we translate ark is tabah, which is also the same word to describe the basket that Moses was laid in as a baby. This brings us to a calendar. When did the flood take place? Bishop James Ussher dates the flood, according to the genealogical records in the Bible, as 2348 BC. Many scholars, however, say there are enough variations in the genealogical records that it would probably have taken place anywhere between 3000 and 2000 BC. Whether or not Noah learned how to build the same kind of ark as the Egyptians did, we do not know, but it seems that they were very similar. They definitely had the technology to make this happen. Noah's Ark may well have been the largest ship built at that time, which would fit very well with the rest of this amazing story. What was the pitch that sealed the ark? Well, some claim it had to be oil, and then claim that there wasn't any oil at the time. I like to look at the Hebrew for clues. Noah is told to cover the inside and outside of the ark with pitch. The word for cover is kafar, while pitch is kofar, which is why you may see them both translated as pitch in certain versions. So cover and pitch are closely related. Kafar, cover, is usually translated as atonement. So this gives us huge clues about the mercy seat covering the Ark of the Covenant later on. Kofar is the henna plant, an Egyptian tree. We know that the Egyptians stuffed reeds or grass in between wooden planks to seal their ships. What if Noah used henna to seal his ark? Kofar can also denote bitumen, which is the black asphalt we use on our roads, which is petroleum-based. The only place we are given that definition, though, is here in this verse. We also do not know exactly what kind of wood was used in building the ark. Well, our English Bibles tell us it was gopher wood. That word is only used once in the Bible, so it is not thought to be accurate. There were ships built out of very hard woods in those days. Teak is a hardwood that resists deterioration for thousands of years, so that is a strong possibility. If so, it may still be around today, as many have claimed. I've heard people say that Noah preached repentance while he was building the ark, but I see no evidence for this. God said he was going to save only Noah, Mrs. Noah, their 3 boys, and their respective wives. The point of the flood was not like Sodom and Gomorrah, where God was punishing them for evil, but to have an actual decreation and a new creation. There was no need for repentance at this point. Jesus preached repentance to them after his death, because the point was to wipe out all the half-breeds that would eventually interfere with the messianic seed line. Therefore, God needed a clean slate in the genealogical record of Adam. Only Noah fit that bill. In our creation, decreation, creation cycle then, Noah becomes the head of all mankind from here on out. And we work our way backward through the creation cycle. The animals are next. God told Noah to take 2 of every kind of unclean animal, male and female, and 7 sevens of every kind of clean animal, male and female. Scholars are divided on whether that was 7 of each kind or 14 of each kind. I lean toward 14 since they were to be male and female, so it would need to be an even number. What is a kind? A kind is not a species. While there are 1.2 million species of animals identified today, there may be as many as 10 million different species of animals on Earth, with 98% being fish, invertebrates, or non-animals. That would leave about 34,000 land vertebrates. Noah did not take all those species, which are the smallest grouping of the animal classification system, on the ark. A kind would necessarily mean a group of like animals. Some say it was the next classification up, a family or a genus. Either way, it must have been similar to how the Bible classifies animals as a more broad-brushed group of similar animals. The Hebrew word for kind is min, and is used mostly in creation language, the flood, and in various examples such as falcon kind, raven kind, hawk kind, heron kind, locust kind, beetle kind, grasshopper, vulture, fish, etc. We can see that these are more generic than just species. I have seen estimates from 2,000 to 16,000 animals on the ark. We will base our figures here on the higher number, 16,000. John Woodmore has done extensive work on the feasibility of the ark, and I will use many of his findings here. He compiled a list of all the living and known extinct genera of land vertebrates, which were then broken down into 28 orders. The first 3 orders, perching birds, scaled reptiles, and non-flying rodents, were significantly larger in size in comparison to the other 25 orders. Woodmore did most of his figures based upon all medium and large animals entering the ark as juveniles, not babies, shortly before the reproductive age. However, his calculations also show that there would have been plenty of room for all these animals and their food, water, and waste if every animal was an adult as well. Based upon an exhaustive study of every kind of land vertebrate animal possible, including those now extinct, he comes up with 7,428 kinds of mammals, 4,602 kinds of birds, and 3,724 kinds of reptiles, for a total of 15,574 kinds of land vertebrate animals on the ark. We shall round it off to 16,000 for this debate. While about 85% of the land animals on the ark were smaller than a beagle, the median animal would have been about the size of a small rat, about 100 grams. How did all the animals get into the ark? First, God gave man dominion over the animals in the creation story, so Noah had that. How do the animals get to our zoos today? Man brings them from one part of the earth to the other. Noah and his family had 100 years to accomplish this. Zoos are not new. He could have collected animals for a long time and chosen the best pair when it came time to board the ark. If they were all on one continent, which was highly likely, this would not have been a problem. This was a decreation of Adam naming all the animals. If we think that Adam named each kind of animal, then Noah would have brought them on the ark. Perhaps the animals migrated to Noah. God made a donkey talk, a fish swallow Jonah, locusts to devour crops, kept lions from eating Daniel, used the ravens as a food delivery service to Elijah. Why couldn't God cause these animals to migrate to Noah if he so directed them? And that sloth, he probably used to be a lot faster in those days. Noah probably had quite the zoo going for many years, getting to know the animals and their habits, as well as the animals growing to trust him and his family. When it came time to board the ark, they would have gladly followed their zookeeper in. How did Noah know which animals were clean and which were unclean? Either God told him, or it was passed down to him from Adam, who knew which animals were used for sacrifices. There are many details we simply do not know, such as how many days Noah was prepared to be on the ark. As it turned out, they were on board for 371 days. I would assume they actually had food to last quite a bit longer than that, since they would need to eat after they landed as well. So food is next in our decreation cycle. Concentrated dry foods would have had to make up the bulk of the food supply. Barn-dried hay, 50%. Lightly compressed sunflower seed, hay pellet, 16%. Doubly compressed heavy oat hay, 12%. Horse and cattle pellets, 7%. Dried fruits and grains, which are peas, lentils, seeds, and rice, 6%. Rarely, they may have also had fresh meat, 15%. Dried meat, 9%. Compressed dried meat, 4%. Dried fish, 29%. And water that was needed was 4 million liters, about 9.4% of the ark volume. What happened to all the poop and pee? What everyone wants to know, right? With 16,000 animals, it would be 12 tons daily. While we do not know exactly what Noah did with this, there are many possible scenarios which would have handled this part of the traveling zoo. Today's zoos are not very efficient and are quite labor intensive. But factory farms and laboratories for animals are quite efficient in how they house and care for animals today. We can take some clues from them. Manure from smaller animals tends not to be much of a problem at all. One hen house that held 16,000 laying hens in cages allowed all the manure to accumulate for 5 years with no problem, while other hen houses have gone for as long as 15 years with no removal of feces. Manure from the larger animals, even if they were juveniles, is our main concern here. Some possible solutions would be sloped, self-cleaning floors that end in a gutter that is periodically cleaned out, or a manure pit that accumulates or is vermicomposted. A slatted floor, like our rabbit cages today, also works well, with the same results as above. The excrement could have been discarded overboard, or it would have mostly dried, or it could have been composted. Flies would have been attracted to fresh manure, but not dried manure. If there were more than 2 flies, the animals probably ate them for an extra nutrition. For animals that needed bedding, there were also several options. In a stall where the animals are allowed to roam freely, a very thick layer of bedding can be used to soak up the urine and absorb the manure, and as long as the animals do not come in contact with it, the potential problem for parasites and pathogens, they will be fine for a year. If the animals are in much smaller stalls, they can also have sloping or slatted floors on one end that was cleaned up daily. Those would require a smaller amount of bedding since it would ostensibly stay clean. This would be much more time intensive, however. A third method would be to put the animals in stalls that are so small that they cannot turn around, and they would defecate into a gutter behind them and eat in the trough in front of them. I think we know what that looks like. Of course, they did have 100 years to prepare for this, so they could have trained all the animals to use the toilet in that amount of time. What about farts? Wouldn't they cause an explosion? First, that can be somewhat regulated by the foods they ate. But second, methane explosions in modern animal housing are very rare, and the few that have happened were because of little to no ventilation. Remember that the ark had a window of 144 square meters, so there would have been plenty of ventilation. What about pest control? If there was a problem with certain pests multiplying in this environment, they always had cats, dogs, and mongooses that could have roamed the ark to help keep the rodents at bay. Did the ark stink? Maybe. But humans can get used to almost any smell very quickly and become desensitized to urine and feces in just a few days. More poop and more urine does not equal more smell. It is the liquid that is the most potent and carries the greatest potential for harm. Have you ever tossed a cow patty like a frisbee? No smell, no toxins. Rinsing down feces actually causes more potential for harm than allowing it to compost or accumulate and dry out. Of course, maybe they just toss it overboard every day as well. Perhaps the very best way to deal with all this urine and manure would have been vermicomposting, which is used in many animal cages today. The cage is built in layers, and the bottom layer is composed of earthworms or mealworms. A single rabbit's cage only needs 1.5 centimeters thick of earthworms, while large animals would require 60 centimeters. The worms compost all the manure and would multiply at such a fast rate that they would actually need to get rid of them on a regular basis. These would now serve as fresh food for some of the animals. There would be no work on the part of a human except to stir the manure once a week or so and gather worms to feed the animals. This would also have supplied some great composted soil to plant new crops in. Now, how in the world could 8 adults possibly take care of these 16,000 animals on the ark for 1 year? For comparison, modern-day animal labs have 1 worker for 5,900 mice, rats, or rabbits. In factory farming, 1 man takes care of 3,840 pigs, or 5,000 cattle in mechanized feedlots, or 30 to 50,000 laying hens. If Noah and his family only had a shovel, a bucket, and a wheelbarrow, however, 1 person can handle several hundred rabbits, 842 pigs, 500 steers, 2,000 pigeons, 1,000 guinea pigs, or up to 9,000 laying hens. Storing food near each animal would have saved a ton of time, as well as having self-feeding devices. Drinking troughs could have been stored adjacent to or nearby the feeding troughs for many animals. Water could have been piped in. The ancient Minoans and Egyptians had extensive plumbing, and animals have long been trained to turn water spouts on and off. Depending on which waste removal systems were in place would determine the amount of time necessary for that chore, which could have been very little time for vermicomposting to more labor-intensive methods, such as shoveling it overboard every day. Not likely. In addition to the 8 adults working on the ark, they certainly could have used many of the animals to help do some of the work and carry various supplies when necessary. Allowing for 10 hours a day for 8 adults, that is 80 work hours a day. Based upon manpower studies, which are too extensive to show here, 16,000 animals could have been fed, watered, and waste removed in about half of those allotted hours, which would equal 7.2 seconds manpower per animal per day. Structured wisely, this is well within the range of possibility, although it is entirely possible to have all 3 functions, food, water, and waste, completely automated and not need any direct human manpower for those areas. Smaller animals would require much less care, and they made up the bulk of the animals, while the medium and larger animals would take a little bit longer. This would leave another 40 work hours per day for Noah and his crew to exercise the animals, for medical needs, and to perform maintenance and cleaning. It is also highly likely that Noah and his family rested on the Sabbath, if everything was automated except for emergencies. This would have given them the strength necessary to keep going indefinitely. Noah had 7 days to get 16,000 animals into the ark. If they were already living in a zoo, a menagerie, a circus type environment, and Noah had had time to observe them and pick those most likely to behave and breed, the survival of the fittest, he may well have trained them to obey, may well have had their feeding, water, and waste removal systems long in place, and it would have been a relatively simple matter of moving them from outside the ark to inside the ark. However it worked, we know Noah got it done in 7 days. Then God shut the door. Day 1 of the flood. 2/17/600 of Noah's life. I guess that was the Noahic calendar. In the creation story, we are told that the waters that first covered the earth were then gathered into 2 places, above and below. Those waters were now poured down from above and burst forth from below, so that the whole earth was once again covered in water. Our decreation cycle is now complete. While the sun, moon, and stars were probably still in place, the storm clouds would have covered them up so that they would not have been visible. We are back to the very watery beginning of creation. How deep did the water get? Genesis 7:20 should be translated. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward. That's the measurement from the bottom of the ark. And the mountains were covered. That means that the highest mountains would have to be covered by more than 15 cubits so that the ark would not hit bottom somewhere. Other than that, we do not know. 40 days and 40 nights the waters pounded the earth, the land, back under the water, back to the formless and void nature it began with. All the people, all the Nephilim, all the animals and birds, but not the fish, died. Notice that all the trees and plants did not die, although I'm sure many were destroyed. They were just covered with water once again. The mass of water continued for a total of 150 days before God restrained the waters and sent a wind to dry them up. Now we begin our new creation cycle. 7/17/600 of Noah's life. The ark touches ground on the mountains of Ararat. Where was it for the last 5 months? Floating hither and thither. There is no reason to believe that it didn't go anywhere, but I think that God steered it into the place he wanted them to land. 10/1/600. 40 days after anchoring on Mount Ararat, they can now see mountaintops. That means the waters receded 22.5 cubits, 33.75 feet, in 40 days. Not quite a foot a day. Noah sends out a raven, then a dove every 7 days. You know the story. Where did the dove get a freshly picked olive leaf? Olive leaves are extremely hardy and will grow most anywhere, even under precipices or on stony ground. But they also will regenerate from even a piece of the tree. A broken off branch, a root, some bark, or any tree fragment can start growing again if it touches soil. It does not even need to be properly planted. 4 to 8 weeks is all it needs to become rooted again. And if it was a branch that became rooted again, it wouldn't take long for it to begin growing new leaves again. 1/1/601, Noah's birthday. Noah removes the cover, the mercy seat. God had shown great mercy to Noah and every living being in the ark. And the ground looked dry, but it wasn't dry enough to move out of the ark until 2/27/601. 1 year and 10 days of the earth being baptized for a new birth. No local flood has ever lasted 371 days. By this time, the waters have parted once more. The earth, dry land, has come forth out of its watery grave. Trees and plants are sprouting and growing afresh. The clouds have been rolled back to reveal the sun, moon, and stars once more. And now it is time for the animals to get off the ark and populate the earth again. And what about the fish? Most fish will gradually acclimate to different levels of salt in the water, whether it is more or less than they are used to. This would be why it took so long to flood the earth, and why it took so long for the waters to recede. Those fish needed that time to acclimate. Of course, not all survived. It was still survival of the fittest in that storm. After Noah offered up some of those clean animals as a sacrificial thank offering to the Lord, God lifted the curse from the earth and said he would never kill every living creature again, and the functions of the sun, moon, and stars were restored forever. Then God said that now the animals would be afraid of man because man could now eat them. This means that animals were not afraid of man before the flood. This would make it much easier to get all those animals to come with Noah on the ark. And just as Adam and his 3 sons began the first creation, so Noah and his 3 sons will populate this earth once more. One of the strongest arguments for a worldwide flood is population. Is it possible that the 7.3 billion people on earth today all came from Noah and his 3 sons? Let's do some math. The first reliable world population data we have is in 1804 at 1 billion. In 2012, it was 7 billion. During those 208 years, the population doubled about every 74 years. This is an annual growth rate of 0.94%. For every 100,000 people at the beginning of the year, there would be 100,940 at the end of the year. To calculate the population growth from the flood to today, let's be conservative and cut that rate in half, making the population doubling time at 150 years and the annual growth rate 0.463%. If Adam and Eve lived 6,000 years ago, divided by the 150 years population doubling time, there would be 40 doublings. That would equal 2.2 trillion people by today, which is over 300 times today's population. If the flood were local, where are all those other 2 trillion people today? However, if the flood was 4,500 years ago, divided by 150, the population doubling time, that would equal 30 doublings, which would then equal 6.4 billion people, which is very close to today's population. Remember, we used very conservative population doubling numbers, so today's population is well within the scope of that possibility. In 1,500 more years, if we continue at this rate, we will be at 2.2 trillion people or more. If, as many believe, Adam was not the first man, then there is an even bigger problem with world population math. If you start with Noah's 3 sons and their wives and calculate the population doubling time to 7.1 billion people in 4,500 years, we get an average doubling time of 149 years at a growth rate of 0.465%. Sounds about right to me. Genesis 10 is known as the Table of Nations and is the list of the 70 nations that descended from Noah's 3 sons. Yes, it is possible to get the races we have today from the same set of ancestors, which just goes to show that we truly are all one big happy family. None of us are any better or worse than another. Also, some of the other gods apparently thought they were immune to being punished for having sex with women because God promised not to destroy every living being with a flood again. So they tried their hand at it. And there were more Nephilim babies born as well, although it does not appear to be as many. And then the Tower of Babel was probably built around 2240 BC, and the mixed languages forced the people to move away from one another. The earth was divided in the days of Peleg, around 1875 BC, and the continents drifted or separated in some way. And that is an easy explanation to me as to how all the various people groups were on the different continents after the flood. God then ends the story by establishing a covenant with Noah and with every living creature for all future generations. And this was confirmed by a rainbow. This is also one of the strongest proofs of a worldwide flood, because if God was only promising not to flood Israel again, why would we need to see a rainbow here in Texas, or in Japan, or way down in Australia? Those kangaroos don't care about Israel's flood, do they? For that matter, why was there a large local flood in Israel last week? Did God forget his rainbow covenant? Not only is Jesus a direct descendant of Noah, but he also spoke about Noah and the flood as if they were real events in Matthew 24 and Luke 17. Jesus readily identified parables when he was using them. Noah was also listed in the Hebrews 11 Wall of Fame for all those who had great faith as being one of the greats. My cousin was a mayor in one of the cities that was ravaged by Hurricane Katrina, and she won many awards for her work in restoring her city. But that pales in comparison to Noah's feats in surviving a worldwide flood. And even Peter seemed to think that the story of Noah and his ark was a true story. And he specifically says twice that only 8 people survived in that ancient world. The biblical evidence clearly points to a real worldwide flood, and the details of how it all worked can be shown 10 different ways from Sunday as being plausible. Surviving this flood was not a miracle, but simply righteous Noah obeying God's instructions for how to live through the decreation and new creation cycle. For the most part, I have not touched on the issues that will come up in the challenges from the local view and the myth view, so there is much more evidence to come in this debate.